November 30, 1939, the sky above Helsinki darkened with the sound of engines. Moments later, Soviet bombers released their first payloads, and the quiet capital of Finland erupted in flames. The Winter War had begun. For months, tension had built between Moscow and Helsinki. Joseph Stalin, ever suspicious of the West, feared that Finland, a small but fiercely independent neighbor, might one day serve as a bridgehead for enemies to threaten Leningrad. The Soviet Union demanded a buffer zone, territorial concessions, and military bases. The Finns, proud of their sovereignty, refused. Negotiations broke down, propaganda intensified, and in late November, the Red Army staged a border incident near the village of Manila. Claiming Finnish artillery had fired first, it was a lie. A carefully planned pretext for invasion. At dawn, the Soviet Union unleashed one of the largest military offensives in northern history. Over 450,000 soldiers, 1,500 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft. They expected a swift victory. After all, Finland had barely 200 tanks in total, and fewer than 300 aircraft, many outdated biplanes from the 1920s. But what the Soviet command underestimated was the spirit of the Finnish people, led by Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Mannerheim, a veteran of the old Tsarist army. Finland prepared to defend its freedom with every resource it had. Men, women, even teenagers joined the national effort. Citizens dug trenches, built bunkers, and shipped food and weapons to the front. Mannerheim ordered a defensive line across the Karelian Isthmus, the most likely axis of invasion, a stretch of forests, lakes, and marshes fortified with concrete bunkers and anti-tank barriers. This line, soon to become legendary, would bear his name, the Mannerheim Line. As Soviet columns advanced, they met not the quick surrender they had been promised, but a wall of snow, gunfire, and determination. The Red Army struggled from the first day. Their maps were poor, their uniforms thin, their equipment unsuited for sub-zero conditions. Tanks froze, engines refused to start, food spoiled in the cold, and soldiers, many from southern Russia or Ukraine, had never experienced temperatures that dropped to -40°C. In contrast, the Finnish troops, known as sotilaat, or soldiers, moved like ghosts across the white landscape. They wore pure white camouflage. They skied silently through forests, appearing and vanishing like the wind. Armed with rifles, grenades, and the soon-to-be famous Molotov cocktail, they struck Soviet convoys, burned tanks, and disappeared back into the snow. By mid-December, the impossible had happened. Entire Soviet divisions had been annihilated. The world, stunned, watched as tiny Finland held off one of the largest armies on earth. The Mannerheim Line stretched across the Karelian Isthmus, a series of trenches, bunkers, and obstacles carved from rock and ice. It was not a modern fortress, but it was built by men who understood their land. They used granite, timber, and frozen earth. Every swamp and forest became a natural defense. In early December, Soviet forces launched their first major assaults. They came in waves, hundreds of tanks, thousands of infantry, and relentless artillery fire, but the terrain swallowed them. The Finns used the forest itself as a weapon. They ambushed columns from both sides, cut supply lines, and used snipers hidden high in trees. One of those snipers would become a legend, Simo Haiha, the White Death. In less than 100 days, Haiha would kill over 500 Soviet soldiers, often in temperatures below -30. He moved silently, never used a scope, to avoid the glint of sunlight that could betray his position. To the Soviets, he became a ghost, a symbol of Finnish defiance. Elsewhere, battles raged across the north. At Suomussalmi, 2 entire Soviet divisions were surrounded and destroyed. The Finns, outnumbered 10-1, cut the enemy's supply lines, trapped them in the forest, and starved them in the freezing cold. When the smoke cleared, thousands of Soviet soldiers lay dead or frozen, their tanks abandoned like monuments to folly. In the west, the village of Kala became another symbol of endurance. Finnish defenders held their positions for over 100 days, repelling attack after attack. Their slogan became famous, Kala Kesta, Kala holds. By January 1940, international admiration had reached its peak. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York printed headlines celebrating Finland's resistance. Volunteers from Sweden, Norway, and other countries rushed to join the fight. The League of Nations condemned the Soviet Union and expelled it for its aggression. but the price of glory was high. Every day, Finland lost men, ammunition, and precious supplies. Factories worked around the clock, but the strain was unbearable. The Soviets, meanwhile, learned from their defeats. They reorganized, improved logistics, and prepared a second, even larger offensive. By February, the Red Army returned, stronger, better coordinated, and determined to break the Mannerheim Line at any cost. The battles that followed were among the most brutal of the war. Soviet artillery pounded the Finnish positions for days. When the bombardment stopped, waves of infantry advanced, only to be met by machine gun fire from bunkers buried in snow. The line held, until it could hold no longer. By early March, Soviet forces finally broke through near Viipuri. The defenders, exhausted and out of ammunition, were forced to retreat. Finland had no reserves left. It was time to face reality. March 13, 1940, the Winter War was over. In Moscow, representatives of Finland and the Soviet Union signed a peace treaty. Finland was forced to surrender 11% of its territory, including the Karelian Isthmus, the city of Viipuri, and parts of Lapland. Over 400,000 Finns, a full tenth of the population, were evacuated from their homes. For the Soviet Union, the war was officially a victory, but it was a victory paid for in blood. Over 120,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and more than 200,000 wounded. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed. The Red Army, once feared across Europe, was revealed to be deeply flawed, poorly led, poorly trained, and unprepared for modern war. For Finland, defeat was bitter, but not total. They had preserved their independence. Their army had survived intact, their nation still stood, and their courage had inspired the world. Many historians believe that Stalin's disastrous performance in the Winter War convinced Adolf Hitler that the Red Army was weak, a dangerous miscalculation that would lead him to launch Operation Barbarossa less than 2 years later. For the Finns, the scars of the Winter War never faded. In 1941, they would again find themselves drawn into conflict, this time alongside Germany, in what they called the Continuation War. But that is another story. The Winter War remains one of the most remarkable chapters of the 20th century. A story of endurance against impossible odds, of courage born from cold and darkness. When the snow fell over Karelia, when the forests burned red in the night, when the world held its breath, a small nation stood alone, and showed that even the smallest people can leave the largest mark on history. Nak Ket, Don De Va Tieng Geo Lan Tan Dan, Jong Kucham Rai, narration outro. They lost their land, but kept their soul. They lost the war, but saved their nation. This was the Winter War.